Welcome to our channel, where we commemorate the rich history and culture of Black people worldwide. Today, we delve into a topic that may leave a bitter taste in your mouth as we uncover the troubling history of the tobacco industry and its deep connections to the slave trade. While we're all familiar with the controversial history of tobacco, its darkness extends far beyond the addictive nature of nicotine. In fact, the roots of the tobacco industry are closely intertwined with the grim legacy of slavery, where enslaved Africans were brutally exploited to advance this lucrative trade. Imagine this, it's the 17th century, and tobacco is emerging as a booming commodity in the American colonies. Demand is skyrocketing, and tobacco plantations are sprouting up everywhere. But a pressing question arises: who will undertake the grueling work of planting, cultivating, and harvesting this cash crop? This is where the horrifying reality of enslaved Africans comes into play. Men, women, and children were torn from their homes in Africa, crammed into the deplorable conditions of the Middle Passage, and sold as if they were property to toil on tobacco plantations in the New World. Shocking as it may be, by the late 17th century, the majority of tobacco plantations in the American colonies, especially in Virginia, relied on enslaved laborers, constituting a staggering 70% of the workforce. But the horrors didn't stop there. Enslaved Africans were subjected to back-breaking labor from sunrise to sunset, compelled to toil in sweltering heat amid toxic chemicals and perilous working conditions. Any perceived disobedience was met with ruthless punishment. Many succumbed to exhaustion, diseases, and the brutal treatment they endured. Yet, their blood, sweat, and tears fueled the burgeoning tobacco industry, generating enormous profits for slave owners and tobacco merchants alike. As we delve into the dark past of the tobacco industry, let's never forget the harsh reality that enslaved Africans were forcibly thrust into this trade. Their lives and labor were shamelessly exploited for the benefit of a few. Before we delve deeper into this subject, please like and hit the subscribe button to stay on the channel. The history of the tobacco industry is inseparable from the histories of colonization and the slave trade. The documented cultivation of tobacco began in 1531 in Hispaniola, where Christopher Columbus's crew observed native people smoking tobacco. However, it was the British who transformed the tobacco industry into a global enterprise. They colonized Virginia in 1607 and began cultivating tobacco in large quantities, which they exported to Europe. By 1614, the first shipment of Virginia tobacco arrived in England, and within a decade, it became the colony's most valuable export. Virginia's economy became dependent on tobacco, with the English government even granting the Virginia Company a monopoly on its production and trade. The demand for tobacco soared in Europe, making it the world's most traded commodity after sugar. It became a staple in the European diet, with doctors even prescribing it for various ailments. Nevertheless, the success of the tobacco industry was built on the backs of enslaved Africans who were forcibly transported to the Americas to work on plantations. Tobacco cultivation demanded intensive labor, and enslaved Africans provided a reliable and cost-effective labor source. Initially, English colonizers tried to rely on indentured servants, poor Europeans who worked in exchange for passage to the colonies. However, these servants were expensive to transport and had a high mortality rate. As the demand for tobacco surged, colonizers turned to enslaved Africans as a cheaper labor force. The slave trade became a massive industry, with millions of Africans sold and transported across the Atlantic to work on tobacco, sugar, and other plantations. The first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619. Initially, they were treated as indentured servants, and some earned their freedom after a set number of years. However, as the demand for tobacco grew, more enslaved Africans were imported to work in the fields. By the 1660s, slavery had become the dominant labor system in the Chesapeake Bay region, and it persisted until the Civil War. Enslaved Africans were considered the most valuable asset in the tobacco industry. They cleared land, planted and tended crops, and processed tobacco leaves for export. The conditions under which they worked were harsh and inhumane. Enslaved Africans endured long hours of toil in scorching sun, operated heavy machinery, and handled dangerous chemicals, putting their lives at risk. Slavery was justified by enslavers on the premise that Africans were an inferior race and thus suited for hard labor. Slave owners often asserted that they were providing a valuable service to their enslaved individuals by offering them food and shelter in exchange for their labor. However, this claim couldn't have been further from the truth. In reality, many enslaved people endured brutal treatment, including physical and sexual abuse if they failed to meet their work quotas. The working conditions for slaves were deplorable, with cramped and unsanitary living quarters, often forcing them to sleep on dirt floors. Diseases and illnesses ran rampant, leading to the deaths of numerous slaves due to exposure, malnutrition, and sickness. These appalling conditions also took a severe toll on their mental health, resulting in depression, anxiety, and various other mental health issues. The intensive labor required for cultivating tobacco exacerbated the already grim situation. Historian Philip Morgan notes that by the mid-18th century, Chesapeake tobacco planters expected workers to transplant a seedling every 2 minutes and to plant 350 hills per day. After transplanting, the tobacco seedlings needed nearly constant tending until harvest. This included tasks like weeding, suckering, and removing worms and beetles, all of which required workers to pay close attention to individual plants, work hunched over, and perform tasks by hand, all under close supervision. This work was not only gruesome but also had severe consequences for slaves who couldn't meet the quality standards. John Thompson, an escaped slave, testified about the nature of the work, explaining how tobacco plants were usually infested with worms. When found, the enslaved individuals were often required to eat these pests, which could lead to serious health problems later on. Unfortunately, slaveholders did little to provide medical assistance. While this provides some insight into the gruesome aspects of slavery in the tobacco industry, it barely scratches the surface of the torture and inhumane treatment that enslaved people endured. According to escaped slave Lewis Clark, who recounted his experience on a Kentucky tobacco plantation, slaves were forced to stoop for hours to clear tobacco plants of the worms infesting them. Those who attempted to rest were swiftly disciplined with the crack of a whip. Despite these terrible conditions, enslaved Africans developed expertise in tobacco cultivation and processing. They excelled at growing and curing tobacco, using innovative techniques to produce high-quality tobacco that was in great demand in Europe. They also created new tobacco varieties resistant to disease and adaptable to various climates. Enslaved Africans were responsible for the labor-intensive process of hand-rolling tobacco into cigars and cigarettes, showcasing a high degree of skill and precision. Enslaved Africans played a pivotal role in clearing vast tracts of land, planting and tending crops, and processing tobacco leaves for export, thereby contributing significantly to the economies of many nations, including the United States. The profits generated from the tobacco industry played a crucial role in financing the American Revolution, providing the colonies with resources to fund their war efforts. The British also heavily relied on tobacco, making the colonists' control of the tobacco trade a key factor in their successful bid for independence. The legacy of slavery in the tobacco trade is a haunting reminder of deep-rooted injustices that persist throughout history. Although the abolition of slavery marked a critical turning point, its effects continue to reverberate, even in modern times, including within the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry, built on the backs of enslaved Africans, has a troubling history that continues to cast a shadow today. Post-slavery, exploitative labor practices persisted, including sharecropping, tenant farming, and other forms of labor exploitation that disproportionately affected black communities. This legacy of systemic racism has had lasting consequences, perpetuating cycles of poverty, inequality, and discrimination. Furthermore, evidence of modern-day slave labor in the tobacco industry has emerged, revealing that the exploitation of vulnerable workers persists in some regions worldwide, including parts of Africa, Asia, and South America. Reports have surfaced of workers enduring deplorable conditions, receiving low wages, and falling into debt bondage in tobacco production. These workers often face hazardous working conditions, exposure to harmful chemicals, and a lack of access to basic labor rights and protections. According to the International Labour Organization, ILO, an estimated 1.56 million children engage in hazardous work in tobacco production globally. This includes exposure to harmful chemicals, long hours of labor, and denial of education, all clear violations of children's rights. Countries like Malawi, one of the largest tobacco producers in Africa, have reported widespread child labor and poor working conditions in their tobacco fields, with children as young as 5 years old working and being denied education. Similar concerns about child labor and poor conditions have arisen in countries like India, Indonesia, known for clove cigarette production, and Brazil, which is also implicated in labor exploitation with hazardous working conditions and debt bondage. These examples illustrate the pervasive issue of exploitation in the tobacco industry, documented through credible research and investigations by reputable organizations, including human rights groups and labor rights organizations. This underscores the urgent need for ongoing efforts to address and eradicate labor exploitation in the tobacco trade, and to ensure the protection of workers' rights worldwide. The legacy of slavery in the tobacco industry serves as a stark reminder of the exploitation and oppression that have persisted throughout history. Although the abolition of slavery was a crucial milestone, its consequences continue to affect people's lives today. As we reflect on this topic, it is essential to recognize this legacy and work towards a future where exploitation and oppression are never tolerated. Thank you for watching.